Snow falls hard over Northwood Ridge. On Christmas Eve, a small town holds its breath as a wealthy heir steps out of a black SUV, his anger sharper than the winter wind. Under glowing streetlights, an old man dressed as Santa is knocked to the ground, his kindness treated like a crime. But someone is watching, a battle-scarred veteran who has seen silence kill before. And beside him, a German shepherd named Valor, trained to hear lies in the dark. One growl, 3 barks, a warning no one dares to understand. Because inside a simple wooden box lies the truth this town buried for decades. What begins as cruelty will become evidence. What begins in fear will end in justice. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe courage still matters, and miracles sometimes walk on 4 legs, subscribe to New Light Stories and share this with someone who needs hope tonight. Snow drifted down in slow, shimmering spirals, as if the sky itself were trying to soften the world for Christmas Eve. Each flake fell with quiet patience, settling onto rooftops, bare branches, and the narrow streets below, muffling the usual sounds of the town. Northwood Ridge, a small mountain community tucked deep into the northern valleys, was usually alive this time of year. Porch bells chimed softly in the wind, radios hummed with old carols, and windows glowed with warmth and laughter. Tonight, something felt different. The town seemed hushed, as though it were holding its breath beneath the cold. Street lamps cast wide halos of muted gold onto the snowbanks, their light blurring at the edges where falling snow thickened the air. Farther down the street, the church windows glimmered faintly, a steady glow that pulsed like a heartbeat against the dark. The world felt suspended between moments, caught somewhere between peace and unease. Evan Hale walked slowly through the main square, his boots pressing deep into the powdery snow, leaving behind a clean trail of steady footprints. He moved without hurry, the way a man does when he has learned that rushing rarely changes the outcome. At 40 years old, Evan carried a kind of strength that didn't demand attention. It was the strength of someone who had learned restraint, shaped by long years of discipline and quiet endurance rather than bravado. He was broad-shouldered and solidly built, standing just over 6 feet tall, with a posture that remained straight even when fatigue weighed on him. His short, dark brown hair was tousled by the wind and streaked with silver at the temples, the kind of early gray that came not from age alone, but from experience. His stubbled jaw and the faint lines etched around his eyes told stories of nights without sleep, of long hours spent listening rather than speaking. Evan wore a burnt orange canvas coat that brushed against his knees, the fabric faded and softened by years of use. Beneath it, a thick gray wool sweater hugged his frame, paired with dark indigo jeans worn pale at the seams. His brown leather boots, scuffed and weathered, had been broken in long ago on uneven ground and frozen trails. On his left wrist sat an old military watch, scratched, battered, still ticking faithfully. A pocket knife rested discreetly on his belt, not as a weapon, but as a habit he had never fully shed. Beside him walked Valor. The 6-year-old German shepherd moved with a quiet alertness, each step measured yet powerful. He was large even for his breed, his frame lean and muscular, built for endurance rather than speed. His coat shimmered in shades of silver gray and pale cream, darker along his back like deliberate strokes of ink, while his muzzle was dusted with a frosty white that made him appear older than he was. His amber eyes were sharp and observant, constantly reading the environment, attuned to shifts in sound, scent, and movement that most humans overlooked. Valor didn't pull at a leash because there wasn't one. He stayed close to Evan's side by choice, matching his pace instinctively. Their bond wasn't rooted in commands or obedience. It was built on trust forged in situations where hesitation could cost lives. Valor had once been a working dog, trained for search and recovery, and although his formal service days were behind him, the instincts never truly left him. In Evan's gloved hands was a simple cloth bag filled with small, carefully chosen gifts. Wooden toys, knitted gloves, peppermint candies wrapped in thin paper. For the past 5 years, ever since he left the army and lost more than he cared to count, Evan had followed the same private ritual. Each Christmas Eve, he walked through the square and left the bag quietly on the steps of the local orphanage. No name, no note. Just a reminder, to himself as much as to anyone else, that gentleness still had a place in the world. Tonight, though, the air felt heavier. Valor sensed it first. He slowed, then stopped altogether, ears lifting as his nose twitched toward the center of the square. A low vibration rumbled briefly in his chest. Not a growl, but something deeper. A warning without urgency. A premonition. Evan noticed immediately. He always did. "What is it, buddy?" he asked softly, his voice barely carrying over the whisper of falling snow. Valor didn't respond with a bark. He simply stood still, eyes fixed ahead, muscles subtly tensing beneath his thick coat. Evan felt a faint chill trace down his spine, not from the cold, but from instinct. Experience had taught him to trust moments like this. At the heart of the square, beneath a towering fir tree wrapped in strands of white lights, stood an elderly man dressed in a handmade Santa suit. Rowan Clay was 68 years old, thin and slightly stooped, but carried himself with a quiet dignity that made him seem taller than he was. A former schoolteacher, Rowan was known throughout Northwood Ridge for his gentle humor and unwavering kindness. His beard, naturally white and softly curled, blended seamlessly with the costume, making the red suit look almost as though it belonged to him year-round. Wire-framed glasses perched low on his nose, fogging slightly as he laughed. Tonight, Rowan bent carefully as he handed small gifts to a handful of homeless children gathered around him. His suit was patched in places, lovingly repaired over the years, and his boots were scuffed but clean. Despite the cold, his smile radiated warmth. "Thank you, Mr. Clay," one little boy called, hugging a toy truck tightly to his chest. Rowan chuckled, eyes sparkling. "Ah, it's Santa tonight, not Mr. Clay," he said, tapping the boy's nose gently. Evan felt a quiet warmth bloom in his chest as he watched. In a world that often rewarded cruelty and indifference, Rowan Clay had chosen kindness again and again, even when it offered little in return. Then the moment shattered. The sound came first, a sudden roar of an engine cutting sharply through the square. Headlights flared, bright and blinding against the snow. A black SUV slid around the corner and skidded to a stop far too close to Rowan's small display. The children jumped back in alarm. Valor stiffened instantly. Evan halted mid-step, his body already preparing for what his mind hadn't yet fully processed. The driver's door slammed open, and the night began to change. The driver's door slammed with a sharp metallic echo that seemed far too loud for a night like this. The black SUV idled at the edge of the square, engine growling impatiently, exhaust spilling into the cold air like breath laced with anger. Snow continued to fall, settling on the hood and windshield, already trying to erase the vehicle's presence, as if the town itself wished it had never arrived. The man who stepped out was young, but there was nothing uncertain about him. His name was Jackson Merritt, 22 years old, the sole heir to the Merritt family fortune. He stood a little over 6 feet, lean rather than broad, with the kind of sharp, angular features that photographers loved and teachers had always mistrusted. His blonde hair was styled deliberately, slicked back even in the snow, and his face, handsome by conventional standards, carried a constant tension around the mouth, as if irritation were his natural state. A faint shadow of stubble traced his jaw, carefully maintained to look effortless. It was the face of a man who had never learned the word no. Jackson wore a black leather jacket that gleamed beneath the street lamp, clearly expensive and clearly impractical for the cold. Beneath it, a patterned shirt peeked out, unbuttoned at the collar, revealing pale skin flushed red by alcohol rather than wind. His boots were polished, untouched by slush or honest labor, and when they hit the ground, he did so with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the world existed for his convenience. The children around Rowan Clay froze. One of them dropped a small wrapped gift into the snow, the paper instantly darkening as it soaked through. Rowan straightened slowly, his movements careful, as though sudden motion might startle a wounded animal. Years in a classroom had taught him how to read moods before words were spoken. "Evening, Jackson," Rowan said gently, keeping his voice calm. "Careful there, you're frightening the kids." Jackson's eyes flicked toward the children, then dismissed them entirely. His attention sharpened on Rowan, irritation twisting his mouth. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he snapped, gesturing broadly at the table, the gifts, the gathering. "You can't just set up shop wherever you want." Rowan rested both hands on the edge of the table, grounding himself. "It's Christmas Eve," he replied. "They're cold. We're sharing what we can." Jackson laughed, short and sharp, the sound carrying across the square like a crack in glass. "Don't give me that. This is merit territory. Everything that happens in this town reflects on my family." The word territory landed heavily. Evan Hale felt it settle into his chest like a stone. He had stopped several yards back, his body angled subtly between Jackson and Rowan without announcing the intention. Valor stood slightly ahead of him now, head level, ears forward, tail still. The dog's focus was absolute, not wild or aggressive, but precise. Jackson noticed Valor and sneered. "What's with the dog?" he said. "You trying to scare people now, old man?" Before Rowan could answer, one of the children whimpered softly and stepped backward, pressing into the shadows near the tree. Rowan instinctively moved, placing himself between Jackson and the group, his thin frame a fragile barrier. That was when Jackson shoved him. It wasn't a full-force punch, not at first, just a careless, contemptuous push meant to assert dominance. But Rowan wasn't steady on the slick snow. His boots slid out from under him, and he fell hard onto his side, the breath knocked from his lungs as he hit the frozen ground. The square erupted in gasps. Valor growled. The sound came from deep in his chest, low and resonant, vibrating with restraint rather than fury. It was a warning meant to be understood. Evan moved instantly. He crossed the distance in seconds, boots biting into the snow as he positioned himself between Jackson and Rowan. His face remained calm, but something cold and immovable had settled behind his eyes. "That's enough," Evan said. Jackson turned, startled that someone had spoken to him like that. He looked Evan up and down, assessing him with quick contempt. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" "A man who won't stand by while you hurt an old teacher," Evan replied evenly. Jackson scoffed. "This doesn't concern you." Evan didn't raise his voice. "It does now." For a brief moment, the world narrowed. Snowflakes drifted between them, catching the light, time stretching thin. Jackson's jaw tightened. He took a step forward, invading Evan's space, testing boundaries the way he always had. Valor shifted, not toward Jackson, but sideways. He took 2 measured steps, placing his body squarely between Jackson and Rowan, then angled his head sharply toward the SUV. His amber eyes locked onto the backseat window, muscles coiled, alert. Jackson noticed the movement and laughed again, louder this time. "What's wrong, mutt?" he taunted. "See a ghost?" Evan didn't answer. His attention had followed Valor's gaze. The SUV's windows were dark, but not empty. Evan caught the faintest outline of a figure shifting inside, someone who hadn't exited the vehicle, someone watching. Valor barked, once, then twice, then a third time. The barks were identical in tone and spacing, controlled, deliberate. Evan felt his pulse change. He knew that sound. It wasn't fear, it wasn't aggression, it was a signal. Before Evan could react, Jackson lashed out again, grabbing Rowan by the collar of his Santa suit and yanking him partially upright. "You think you can make me look bad?" Jackson snarled. "You think you can embarrass my family?" Rowan winced, pain creasing his face, but his voice remained steady. "Christmas doesn't belong to your family, Jackson," he said quietly. "It never did." That was the moment the shove turned violent. Evan stepped in, his hand clamping around Jackson's wrist with controlled force, twisting just enough to break the grip. Jackson stumbled back, swearing, shock flashing across his face as he realized Evan was stronger than he looked. "Let go of me," Jackson shouted. "I will," Evan said calmly, "as soon as you step back." Valor stood frozen between them, teeth bared now, not snapping, not lunging, but unmistakably prepared. The onlookers had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Jackson glanced around, his confidence faltering for just a fraction of a second. Then his expression hardened. He yanked his arm free and smoothed his jacket, masking humiliation with anger. "This isn't over," he said, pointing at Evan. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." He turned and stalked back toward the SUV, slamming the door with unnecessary force. The engine roared, tires spinning briefly before gripping the snow, and the vehicle sped away, taillights disappearing into the storm. Valor didn't relax. He stood rigid, eyes fixed on the empty road long after the SUV was gone, his growl fading into a low, unsettled hum. Evan knelt beside Rowan, helping him sit up. "Are you hurt?" Rowan shook his head faintly, managing a strained smile. "Bruised pride more than bones," he said. though I suspect that boy has been practicing cruelty longer than honesty. Police lights flooded the square moments later as a patrol car pulled up. Deputy Lucas Reed stepped out, a man in his early 30s with a solid build and tired eyes. His dark hair was cropped short, and a trimmed beard lined a jaw that looked like it clenched too often. Lucas had the posture of someone who wanted to do the right thing, and the hesitation of someone who knew the cost. "What happened?" Lucas asked, kneeling beside Rowan. Before anyone could answer, Lucas's radio crackled. His shoulders stiffened as he listened. "Yes, sir," he replied quietly into the mic. "I understand." He lowered the radio slowly. Evan already knew. Lucas avoided Rowan's eyes. "I'm going to help you get checked out," he said. "But I can't file a report tonight." Rowan closed his eyes. Valor barked once more, low, certain. The night, it seemed, had only just begun to reveal what it had been hiding. The snow kept falling long after the black SUV vanished into the darkness, settling over the square as if it meant to erase what everyone had just witnessed. But silence, Evan knew, was never an eraser. It was a weight, and in Northwood Ridge, that weight had been pressing down on people for a very long time. Deputy Lucas Reed helped Rowan Clay to his feet with careful hands. Up close, Lucas looked more worn than his age suggested. He was 32, with a solid work-shaped build and shoulders that sloped slightly forward, as if he were always bracing against something invisible. His dark brown hair was cut short in regulation style, already thinning at the crown, and a neatly trimmed beard shadowed his jaw. His face had strong lines, high cheekbones, a straight nose, a mouth that often seemed caught between apology and resolve. Lucas was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, not because he lacked opinions, but because he had learned which ones were safe to voice. "You should get him inside," Lucas said quietly to Evan, nodding toward Rowan. "It's colder than it looks." Evan slipped an arm under Rowan's elbow, steadying him. Rowan's breathing was shallow, but controlled, the way a teacher might manage himself in front of frightened students. His glasses sat crooked on his nose, and one lens was cracked from the fall. "I've taken worse spills," Rowan murmured, attempting a smile, though none quite so festive. Valor stayed close, positioning himself slightly behind Rowan now, his body angled protectively. His ears flicked constantly, tracking the distant sounds of the town. But his eyes kept drifting back toward the road where the SUV had disappeared. Lucas cleared his throat. "An ambulance is on the way," he said, "just to be safe." Rowan nodded, then looked at him directly. "Will you write it up this time, Lucas?" The question hung in the air between them. Lucas's jaw tightened. He glanced briefly toward the patrol car, then down at the snow beneath his boots. When he looked back up, his eyes were clouded with something heavier than embarrassment. "You heard the radio," he said softly. "You know how this works." Rowan's shoulders sagged, just slightly, not in surprise, but in resignation. "Yes," he replied, "I do." Evan watched the exchange carefully. Years in uniform had taught him how to read people under pressure. Lucas Reed wasn't indifferent. He was afraid in the quiet, grinding way that came from knowing exactly how much power you didn't have. The ambulance arrived, lights flashing without sirens, the paramedics moving quickly and efficiently. As Rowan was guided onto a stretcher, a woman stepped out of the small crowd that had gathered at the edge of the square. Her name was Marlene Goss. Marlene was 72, tall and narrow-shouldered, with a spine that had remained stubbornly straight despite age. Her silver hair was braided tightly down her back, practical and severe, and her face was sharply lined, as if carved by years of mountain wind. Her eyes, a piercing gray, missed very little. She wore a heavy wool coat buttoned all the way to her chin, and gloves patched at the fingertips. Marlene had lived in Northwood Ridge her entire life, and had buried a husband, a brother, and most of her patients there. "I saw the whole thing," she said, her voice firm, directed squarely at Lucas. "Every second of it." Lucas met her gaze. "I don't doubt that," he replied. "Then you know it wasn't an accident," Marlene pressed. "And you know whose fault it was." Lucas didn't answer. Marlene's mouth tightened. "That's what I thought." She turned then, her eyes settling on Evan. "You did the right thing," she said. "Most folks don't anymore." Evan inclined his head slightly. "Someone had to." As the ambulance doors closed and pulled away, the square slowly began to empty. People drifted back to their homes, heads down, conversations hushed. Fear had a way of shortening goodbyes. Lucas lingered, watching the patrol car lights reflect off the snow. Valor approached him, stopping a few feet away. The dog's gaze was steady, assessing. Lucas shifted uncomfortably under it. "Your dog," Lucas said, attempting a faint smile. "He looks like he knows things." Evan answered honestly. "He does." Lucas hesitated, then lowered his voice. "That SUV," he said. "There was someone else in it, wasn't there?" Evan studied him. "You saw it too." Lucas nodded once. "Didn't get a clear look. But Jackson doesn't bring witnesses unless they matter." The words lingered. Lucas straightened, squaring his shoulders as though making a decision he had postponed too many times. "Listen," he said. "I can't help you officially. Not yet, but be careful. The Merritts don't forget people who embarrass them." "I'm not worried about embarrassment," Evan replied. "I'm worried about what they're hiding." Lucas's eyes flicked to Valor again. "So am I." Later that night, Evan walked Rowan's abandoned gift bag to the orphanage steps and set it down gently. The building was dark, the windows black against the snow, but Evan lingered a moment before turning away. The town felt quieter now, stripped of pretense. At home, a small cabin at the edge of the woods, Evan removed his coat and boots, setting them neatly by the door. Valor padded inside, shaking snow from his fur before settling near the hearth. The cabin was modest but orderly. Wood-paneled walls, a heavy table scarred by use, shelves lined with books and old photographs. One framed picture sat apart from the rest. A young boy smiling broadly, snow clinging to his hat. Evan paused before it, his expression unreadable. Valor rose and pressed his head gently against Evan's thigh, grounding him. Evan rested a hand on the dog's neck, fingers curling into thick fur. "You felt it too, didn't you?" Evan murmured. "Something's wrong here." Valor didn't move. He simply stared toward the darkened window, ears forward, listening to a night that no longer felt peaceful. Somewhere beyond the trees, an engine started. Somewhere farther still, a powerful family began asking questions. And deep beneath the snow, truths long buried began to shift. Morning arrived slowly in Northwood Ridge, as if the town itself were reluctant to wake. Snow still clung to rooftops and window ledges, and the roads bore only a handful of tire tracks from the night before. The storm had passed, but it left behind a silence that felt heavier than the snowfall. Evan Hale stood at the edge of the hospital parking lot, hands buried in his coat pockets, breath fogging the cold air as he waited. Valor sat beside him, calm but alert. The German Shepherd's posture was relaxed only on the surface. His ears flicked at every sound, and his amber eyes followed the automatic doors each time they slid open. He had not slept much. Neither had Evan. Northwood Ridge Community Hospital was a squat, aging building of brick and glass, practical rather than comforting. It had served the town for decades, patching up broken bones from the mines, frostbite from the mountains, and the quieter injuries that came from living too long in a place where power rarely changed hands. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and weak coffee. Evan entered with Valor close at his side. A nurse at the front desk glanced up, her eyes briefly softening at the sight of the dog, then flicking to Evan's face with recognition. News traveled fast here, even when people pretended it didn't. "Mr. Clay is in room 12, she said quietly. "He's awake." Evan nodded and moved down the hallway, boots muted against the linoleum. Valor padded beside him, nails clicking softly, his presence grounding. When they reached the door, Evan paused, then knocked once before entering. Rowan Clay lay propped against a stack of pillows, his thin frame looking smaller beneath the white sheets. A purple bruise bloomed along his shoulder, and his glasses sat folded on the bedside table. Despite it all, he smiled when he saw Evan. "You look like a man who didn't sleep," Rowan said gently. "Neither did you," Evan replied, pulling a chair closer to the bed. Valor approached, resting his chin lightly on the mattress edge. Rowan's hand trembled slightly as he reached out to scratch behind the dog's ears. "They always know, don't they?" Rowan murmured. "Before we do." Before Evan could answer, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, measured, confident, unhurried. Not the rushed steps of nurses or the uncertain gait of visitors. These were steps that expected doors to open before reaching them. Valor's head lifted, his ears angled back, and a low sound vibrated briefly in his chest before he stilled completely. The door opened. The woman who entered did so as if the space already belonged to her. Her name was Margaret Merritt, and she was the reason the Merritt name carried weight long before her son learned to wield it. In her early 50s, Margaret was tall and impeccably composed, with a slender build that suggested discipline rather than frailty. Her silver blonde hair was cut into a precise bob, not a strand out of place, framing a face defined by sharp cheekbones and cool blue eyes. Those eyes assessed the room instantly, cataloging every detail with practiced efficiency. She wore a tailored charcoal coat over a dark dress, cashmere scarf draped loosely at her neck. Everything about her spoke of wealth that did not need to announce itself. Two men followed a step behind her, lawyers by the look of them, both in black suits, both forgettable by design. Margaret's gaze flicked briefly to Evan, then to Valor. She paused for half a second longer on the dog, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, before she smiled. "Mr. Clay," she said warmly, "I'm so relieved to see you awake." Rowan's smile faded, replaced by wary calm. "Mrs. Merritt." Margaret approached the bed, her movement smooth, deliberate. "I was devastated when I heard about the incident last night," she continued. "Jackson has always had a temper, but this—" She sighed softly, the sound perfectly measured. This was unacceptable. Evan watched her closely. He had met officers, politicians, and commanders who spoke like this, people who knew exactly which words soothed and which ones silenced. One of the lawyers stepped forward, setting a thin folder on the bedside table. Margaret gestured to it lightly. "We've taken the liberty of preparing an agreement to cover all medical expenses, as well as compensation for your distress." Rowan looked at the folder, but did not open it. "And in exchange?" he asked. Margaret's smile did not waver. "Only a clarification," she replied, "that your fall was the result of icy conditions. An unfortunate accident." Valor growled, not loudly, not aggressively, just enough to cut through the air like a blade. Margaret turned her head toward the dog, her expression curious rather than alarmed. "He seems reactive," she noted. "He's perceptive," Evan said evenly. Margaret's eyes met his fully now. Up close, Evan could see the faint lines around them. Not from age, but from constant calculation. "And you must be the veteran," she said. "Evan Hale." Evan did not confirm or deny it. He simply held her gaze. Margaret nodded, as if that were answer enough. "My son can be difficult," she continued, returning her attention to Rowan. "But the Merritt family has always taken care of this town. We don't want misunderstandings to cause unnecessary harm." Rowan's hand trembled as he pushed the folder back toward her. It wasn't a misunderstanding. The room seemed to cool. Margaret straightened slowly, the warmth draining from her expression, replaced by something colder and more precise. "I think you underestimate how fragile reputations can be," she said quietly, "and how easily people get hurt when they insist on telling the wrong version of a story." Valor stiffened. For the first time since Evan had known him, the dog lowered himself slightly, not in submission, but in caution. His eyes never left Margaret. Evan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Margaret noticed the reaction. For just an instant, her composure cracked, not fear, but recognition, as though she understood exactly what the dog was sensing. "That will be all," she said briskly, turning toward the door. "Think carefully, Mr. Clay. This town survives because people know their place." She paused at the threshold, glancing back once more at Evan. "Good intentions," she added softly, "have a way of attracting consequences." Then she was gone. The room felt lighter and heavier all at once. Rowan exhaled shakily. "That," he said, "is the real danger." Evan nodded. Valor moved closer, pressing his body against Evan's leg, still tense. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Somewhere in Northwood Ridge, lines were being drawn, and none of them would fade easily. The snow had stopped by the time Evan and Valor left the hospital, but the cold lingered, sharp and deliberate, as though winter itself had decided to stay and listen. Northwood Ridge looked deceptively calm in the pale afternoon light. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, and a few cars moved along Main Street, their drivers unaware, or pretending to be unaware, that something fundamental had shifted beneath the town's familiar surface. Evan drove Rowan Clay home in silence. Rowan sat in the passenger seat of the old pickup, wrapped in a thick wool blanket the nurses had insisted upon. His posture was careful, one arm held close to his side, but his eyes were alert, thoughtful, as if the encounter with Margaret Merritt had finally loosened something long buried. Valor rode in the back seat, his head resting between the front seats, amber eyes fixed on Rowan. The dog had not relaxed since the hospital. His breathing was steady, but his attention never drifted, as though he sensed that this next step mattered more than the confrontation in the square. Rowan lived in a narrow two-story house near the edge of town, one of the older homes built when Northwood Ridge still believed its future lay in books and schools, rather than land deals and quiet payoffs. The paint on the siding was faded, and the porch steps sagged slightly with age, but the windows were clean, and warm light spilled out as they arrived. Inside, the house smelled of old paper, cedar, and black tea. Books lined nearly every wall, stacked in neat rows and uneven towers, their spines worn by decades of careful hands. Framed photographs covered the mantel, classrooms full of children, holiday gatherings, faded black and white images of a younger Rowan standing beside colleagues long gone. Rowan moved slowly but purposefully toward the living room, leaning briefly on the arm of an old oak chair. "I suppose," he said quietly, "that now is the time." Evan didn't rush him. He had learned long ago that truth, when forced, often shattered before it could be understood. Rowan crossed to a narrow cabinet tucked beside the fireplace, its wood darkened by age and heat. He knelt with some effort, opened the lower door, and reached inside. His hand emerged holding a small wooden box. It was unremarkable at first glance. Rough pine, hand-carved, no larger than a shoebox. The surface bore faint scratches and dents, the marks of something that had been handled often, then hidden away. On the lid, carved deeply and carefully, was a simple symbol, two intersecting lines forming a crude compass rose. Valor stepped forward immediately. He did not bark. He did not growl. He placed one large paw gently on the edge of the box and froze. Evan felt his breath slow. That reaction, stillness, contact, focus, was one Valor reserved for discoveries, not threats. Rowan exhaled. "I was wondering when he'd recognize it," he said softly. "What is it?" Evan asked. Rowan did not answer right. Away. He lowered himself into the chair, the box resting on his knees, and stared at it as though it were capable of staring back. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but old pain edged every word. "This box, Rowan said, "is the reason Margaret Merritt came to see me today." He opened the lid. Inside were neatly arranged envelopes, flash drives, and a handful of folded documents yellowed with age. Some were labeled in careful handwriting. Others bore dates that stretched back decades. Evan leaned closer, his expression tightening. Rowan selected one envelope and passed it to him. "That," he said, "is a copy of an incident report from the elementary school, dated 1994. It documents an assault. The original no longer exists." Evan skimmed the page. The details were clinical, the language sanitized, but the implication was clear. A child had been hurt. Another child, Jackson Merritt, had been responsible. "They paid to make it disappear," Rowan continued. "They always did." Valor lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked, as if responding to a sound no one else could hear. Rowan reached into the box again and withdrew a small black cassette tape. "That," he said, "is a recorded meeting between Margaret Merritt and the school board." She was very persuasive. Evan's jaw tightened. "Why keep all this?" Rowan's eyes met his. "Because someone had to remember," he replied. "And because I learned early on that memory is dangerous to people who profit from silence." He gestured to the remaining contents. Letters from parents pressured into recanting statements. Photographs of bruises that never made it into official files. Copies of police reports altered beyond recognition. And finally, at the bottom of the box, a small battered flash drive wrapped in a scrap of red cloth. "That one," Rowan said, his voice dropping, "is the reason I never turned this box over to anyone else." Evan hesitated before taking it. "What's on it?" Rowan swallowed. "Video, from a security camera that used to sit behind the old community center. It captured something the Merritts never wanted preserved." Valor let out a low, unsettled sound, his tail stiffening. Rowan leaned back, exhaustion settling into his features. "I've carried this box for nearly 20 years, he said. "I told myself I was waiting for the right time, but the truth is, I was waiting for the right person." Evan felt the weight of that settle on his shoulders. "Why me?" he asked quietly. Rowan looked at Valor first, then back to Evan. "Because you didn't look away," he said, "and because your dog knows when something is wrong in a way the rest of this town forgot." Evan closed the lid of the box carefully. He did not yet open the flash drive. Some truths demanded preparation. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows. Valor moved to stand between Evan and the door, alert but composed. Rowan followed the motion with his eyes. "They'll come for it," he said simply. "Sooner than you expect." Evan nodded. "Then we'll be ready." That evening, as Evan carried the wooden box back to his truck, he felt the town watching, not openly, but from behind curtains and half-closed doors. Northwood Ridge had lived under quiet control for so long that it no longer recognized the sound of courage when it returned. As they drove away, Valor turned once more to look back at Rowan's house, committing the scent, the place, the moment to memory. Somewhere deep beneath the snow, the past had shifted, and it would not stay buried much longer. Night returned to Northwood Ridge with a cold that felt sharper than before, the kind that crept into the seams of houses and settled there, patient and deliberate. Evan drove the last mile to his cabin with the headlights dimmed, a habit learned in places where being seen mattered too much. The wooden box rested on the passenger side floor, wrapped in a wool blanket, secured with a strap as if it were a living thing that might shift if not handled carefully. Valor sat upright in the back, body steady, eyes never still. The cabin stood at the edge of the pines on Alder Spur Road, a narrow cut that climbed away from town and then stopped, as if the builders had decided not to push their luck any farther into the mountains. Evan had rebuilt the place himself after the avalanche, board by board, choosing strength over comfort. The structure was simple, single-story, reinforced beams, a stone hearth, but it had held against storms that tore roofs from lesser homes. Tonight, the wind scraped the siding with dry, persistent fingers. Evan parked beneath the trees and killed the engine. The silence that followed felt too complete. He paused, listening. Snow ticked against metal. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked under weight. Valor's ears angled forward, then flattened slightly, his breath slowing. Not alarm, appraisal. Inside, Evan placed the box on the heavy table and set a kettle on the stove. He did not open the flash drive, not yet. He checked the windows, the door latches, the old radio that still pulled weather and emergency bands. The kettle began to hiss. Valor paced once, then lay down facing the door, chin on his paws, eyes bright. An hour passed, then another. The smell came first. It was faint, almost polite, carried on a shift in the wind. Gasoline, cut thin by cold air. Valor rose in one smooth motion, body rigid. His tail stilled. He did not bark. Evan felt it then, the familiar narrowing of focus. He turned off the stove and moved to the window. Outside, the darkness was thicker near the tree line. A light flickered, then disappeared. Another scent joined the first. Burnt oil, metal, something sharp and human. 3 figures moved between the pines, hoods up, shoulders hunched. Their gait was careless, confident. One of them laughed, the sound muffled by wool and snow. Evan whispered, "Back door." Valor was already there. The crash came from the rear window, glass bursting inward, snow scattering across the floor like a thrown net. Evan grabbed his coat and the blanket-wrapped box. The door handle rattled. A boot slammed. A voice rose, young and reckless. "Find it." The front porch erupted in flame. The fire took quickly, licking up the dry boards with greedy tongues. Heat pressed against the cabin walls. Smoke curled under the eaves. Evan pushed the back door open and stepped into the storm, Valor tight at his side. The cold hit like a wall. Visibility dropped to nothing but white and shadow. They moved downslope toward the truck, Evan's breath steady, each step chosen. He popped the toolbox mounted behind the cab and slid the box inside, covering it with chains and a tarp. Valor barked once, short, urgent. The wind shifted. Fire roared. The porch collapsed with a sound like a breaking rib. Light spilled across the snow, painting the trees in violent orange. Evan turned just long enough to see them clearly now. Jackson Merritt stood nearest the flames, jacket open, blonde hair damp with snow. His face glowed in the firelight, sharp angles thrown into relief, mouth curled in something between triumph and relief. He held a lighter loosely, flipping it open and closed with practiced ease. The other 2 hovered behind him, faces obscured, eager and afraid. "Should have stayed out of it," Jackson called, voice slurred but loud. "This town doesn't need heroes." A small object clinked against the snow near Evan's boot. The lighter skidded to a stop, the metal warm. Etched into the side were 2 letters, J.M. Valor stepped forward and sniffed it, nostrils flaring. His body stiffened, as if a map had been laid beneath his paws. Evan pocketed the lighter. From the dark to Evan's left, a figure emerged, moving fast despite the snow. Marlene Goss barreled toward them, breath ragged, braid whipping behind her. Her coat flapped open, revealing a heavy sweater and a resolve that hadn't dimmed with age. "They're circling back," she said. "You need to go, now." Evan nodded. "Get home. Lock your doors." Marlene hesitated, eyes hard. "Don't let them burn this town, too." She vanished into the white. Evan and Valor slipped into the trees as the cabin gave way, roof collapsing inward, sparks shooting skyward. Jackson laughed, unaware of what he'd dropped, unaware of the scent that now bound him to the night. By morning, the cabin was ash and steam. Evan stood at the edge of the ruins with Chief Dana Malberry, the town's fire chief, a square-shouldered woman in her late 50s, with iron-gray hair pulled tight and a face weathered by decades of volunteer duty. Her coat smelled of smoke. Her eyes missed nothing. "This wasn't an accident," Dana said flatly, studying the burn pattern. "Multiple points of origin. Accelerant." Behind her, Deputy Lucas Reed shifted his weight, jaw clenched, beard darkened by soot. He met Evan's gaze once and nodded, small, decisive. "We found footprints," Lucas said quietly, "fresh, heading back toward town." Dana straightened. "I'll write it as arson," she said. "Let them argue with paper." Evan felt something ease, just a fraction. Later, at the courthouse annex, one of the few buildings with backup power, Evan placed the wooden box on a steel table. Dana stood guard at the door. Lucas hovered near the radio, listening to chatter he could no longer ignore. Valor lay beside the table, chin on his paws, eyes tracking the room. Evan opened the box and finally took out the flash drive. He did not plug it in yet. Outside, Northwood Ridge gathered in knots and whispers. Smoke rose from Alder Spur Road, visible from Main Street. Curtains shifted. Phones rang. Fire, it turned out, asked questions no one could dodge. Morning broke over Northwood Ridge with a pale, fragile light, the kind that followed disaster without quite touching it. Smoke still clung to the valley, drifting low over rooftops and settling into the folds of the hills. From Main Street, the blackened column rising from Alder Spur Road was impossible to miss. People stood on porches longer than usual. Cars slowed. Curtains moved. The fire had done what years of whispers had not. It had made fear visible. Inside the courthouse annex, the air was tight with heat from overworked generators and the low murmur of voices trying to stay quiet. The building was old, its stone walls thick, built in an era when permanence was valued over comfort. A folding table had been set in the center room, steel legs scraping faintly against tile as it was adjusted. On it sat the wooden box, its pine surface dull under fluorescent lights, unassuming and stubbornly solid. Evan stood beside the table, arms crossed, posture relaxed only in appearance. The night had etched deeper lines into his face. Soot still darkened the cuffs of his coat. Valor lay at his feet, calm, watchful, eyes moving from face to face with deliberate interest. The dog's presence seemed to anchor the room, as if reminding everyone that whatever happened next was not theoretical. Deputy Lucas Reed hovered near the doorway, radio clipped to his belt, shoulders squared with a resolve Evan had not seen before. Lucas had shaved that morning, the dark stubble along his jaw replaced by clean lines that made him look younger and more exposed. His eyes, however, were steadier. Chief Dana Malberry stood opposite Evan, reviewing notes on a clipboard. Dana's stance was firm, boots planted, her broad shoulders filling the space easily. Years of fire service had carved confidence into her movements. She had seen what denial did to people and buildings alike, and she had learned when to stop letting others tell her what she was allowed to write down. The door opened again, and Judge Harriet Sloan entered without ceremony. She was in her early 60s, short and straight-backed, with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. Her glasses rested low on her nose, magnifying sharp brown eyes that missed very little. She wore a dark coat over her robe, the hem damp from snow, and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had waited a long time for people to stop lying to her. "What do we have?" she asked. Dana gestured to the table. "Arson, assault, intimidation, and evidence that predates all of it." Judge Sloan's gaze shifted to Evan. "You're the owner of the burned property?" "Yes, ma'am." "And the dog?" Her eyes flicked to Valor. "He's mine," Evan said, "and he's relevant." Judge Sloan studied Valor for a moment longer, then nodded once. So I've been told. They moved quickly then, efficiency replacing hesitation. Dana outlined the fire investigation. Lucas presented the recovered lighter in an evidence bag, the etched initials clearly visible. Judge Sloane's mouth tightened, not in surprise, but recognition. "Bring in the witnesses," she said. Rowan Clay arrived first, escorted by a clerk. He walked carefully, cane tapping softly against the floor. His shoulder was still bruised, but his back was straight. The years had thinned him, but they had not bent him. When he saw the wooden box, something like relief crossed his face. "I wondered when it would finally come out of hiding," he said quietly. Next came Marlene Goss, her braid tucked neatly beneath her coat, her eyes bright and unflinching. She nodded at Evan, then took a seat without being asked. Marlene had dressed as if for church, pressed coat, clean boots, prepared to be taken seriously. The last to enter was Evelyn Hart, a court clerk in her late 20s. She was slight, with chestnut hair pulled back into a low ponytail and pale skin that flushed easily under scrutiny. Her green eyes darted nervously around the room, fingers twisting the edge of her cardigan. She had been on duty the night of the fire, filing late, and Dana had insisted she attend after Valor had reacted sharply to her scent near the evidence table earlier that morning. Judge Sloane folded her hands. "Ms. Hart," she said gently, "you live near the Merritt estate." Evelyn swallowed. "2 houses down. Did you see anything last night?" Evelyn hesitated, eyes flicking to Lucas, then to the door, as if expecting it to open. Valor lifted his head, ears pricked, gaze steady on her, not threatening, waiting. "I saw Jackson," Evelyn said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And 2 others. They parked near Alder Spur. I heard laughing. I smelled gas." The room stilled. Judge Sloane nodded. "Thank you." Evan reached for the wooden box. He opened it slowly, deliberately, as if giving the past time to breathe. He removed the flash drive wrapped in red cloth and placed it on the table. Dana connected it to a laptop. The video loaded without ceremony. The footage was grainy, night shot, the angle skewed. It showed the backlot of the old community center years earlier. A younger Jackson Merritt was visible, his movements sharp and angry, shoving another boy against a brick wall. The audio crackled, but the words were clear enough. Threats, laughter, a scream cut short. Rowan closed his eyes. Judge Sloane watched without blinking. When the video ended, the silence was absolute. "This," Judge Sloane said, her voice calm and cold, "was suppressed." Lucas nodded. "By direct order," he added. "I was told to forget it existed." Judge Sloane removed her glasses. "We're done forgetting." She stood. "Issue warrants, bring in Jackson Merritt, and notify his mother." The response was immediate, a flurry of movement and radio chatter. Outside, word spread faster than the snowmelt. Jackson Merritt arrived within the hour, flanked by lawyers, his confidence frayed, but not gone. His jaw was bruised, his blonde hair damp, his eyes darting. He sneered when he saw Evan, then laughed when he saw Valor. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed. "You're trusting a dog now?" Judge Sloane looked at him over her glasses. "I trust evidence." Valor was released from Evan's side. The dog moved with calm certainty across the room, nose low, tail steady. He sniffed the lighter, the box, the air itself. Then he turned. He walked straight to Jackson and barked 3 times. Identical, measured, final. Jackson's face drained of color. "That's enough," Judge Sloane said sharply. "Take him into custody." The lawyers erupted. The room filled with noise. Evan didn't move. Neither did Valor. Outside, the courthouse steps filled with people. Some cried, some shouted. Most simply watched, stunned. The truth had stepped into the light, and it did not intend to step back. Spring arrived in Northwood Ridge without ceremony. The snow did not vanish all at once. It retreated slowly, reluctantly, revealing scorched earth, softened mud, and the outlines of a town that looked unfamiliar in daylight. Winter had always been the season when things were hidden here. Spring, it turned out, was when they were examined. The Merritt estate stood quiet on the hill above town, gates closed, windows dark. Where there had once been constant movement, cars, staff, quiet meetings, there was now only stillness. Jackson Merritt had been transferred to county jail pending trial, his public bravado replaced by a silence no lawyer could spin. Margaret Merritt remained free, for now, but under investigation, her name suddenly spoken aloud in places it had never reached before. Power, Evan observed, did not disappear. It simply changed shape. Evan stood at the edge of what had once been his cabin, hands resting on his hips, surveying the blackened remains. The fire chief had cleared the site weeks ago, but he had waited before returning, letting the ground settle. Charred beams lay stacked neatly to one side. Ash had blended into the soil, feeding it in a way destruction often did. The air smelled of wet pine and new growth. Valor moved carefully around the perimeter, nose low, tail relaxed. The urgency that had driven him for days after the fire had finally eased. He still checked the wind, still listened, but the edge was gone. Whatever threat had been looming had stepped fully into the open. A truck crunched up the gravel road behind them. Evan turned as Henry Caldwell stepped out. Henry was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with a thick gray beard that he trimmed himself, and hands permanently marked by splinters and calluses. He wore a flannel jacket stained with paint and sawdust, and carried a rolled set of papers under one arm. Henry had lived in Northwood Ridge since before the Merritt's name meant anything, and he had built or repaired half the homes in town. "Figured you'd come back eventually," Henry said, offering a small nod. "Mind if I take a look?" Evan gestured to the site. "Be my guest." Henry walked slowly, studying the foundation, kneeling to examine the stonework. "Frame held longer than it should have," he said. "You built it right." Evan shrugged. "Had help." Henry glanced at Valor, who watched him calmly. "Looks like you still do." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Henry cleared his throat. "Town council met last night," he said. "Unscheduled. Lot of people showed up who never do." Evan raised an eyebrow. "They voted to allocate funds," Henry continued. "Rebuild, not just for you, for anyone who has been quietly paying the price for the Merritt's mess." Evan absorbed that. "They didn't have to." Henry smiled thinly. "Maybe not, but turns out people get tired of being afraid." In town, the changes were subtle but unmistakable. "Rowan?" Clay returned to the square, his arm healed enough to let him carry boxes again. He no longer wore the Santa suit. Spring made that unnecessary. Instead, he organized weekly food distributions under the open sky, his voice steady, his posture unbowed. Children still gathered around him, and adults lingered longer than before, conversations stretching where they used to end abruptly. Deputy Lucas Reed stood a little taller these days. The beard had returned, darker and fuller, framing a jaw set with purpose rather than hesitation. The sheriff had placed him on temporary administrative leave after he testified, but the town's response had been swift and loud. Petitions circulated, meetings filled. Silence, once enforced, had lost its hold. Lucas met Evan one afternoon outside the courthouse, squinting in the sun. "They're offering me the interim position," he said, disbelief edging his voice. "Sheriff?" Evan studied him. "You'll take it." Lucas nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "I will." The trial came quickly. The courtroom was full, benches crowded with people who had learned that presence mattered. Margaret Merritt sat rigid at the defense table, her hair pulled back tighter than ever, her face composed to the point of brittleness. She did not look at Evan. Jackson sat beside her, his youthful sharpness dulled, the arrogance cracked. He avoided Valor's gaze entirely. Judge Harriet Sloan presided with the same unyielding calm she always had. Evidence was presented. Witnesses spoke. The wooden box, now cataloged and secured, became a symbol far larger than its contents. When the verdict was read, there was no celebration, only release, guilty. Outside, the town exhaled. Weeks later, Evan walked the forest trail at dawn, Valor trotting ahead, dew clinging to his fur. The mountains glowed pink in the early light. Birds had returned, tentative at first, then loud with confidence. Evan felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized he had been holding. He stopped at a clearing where stakes marked the outline of a new foundation. Henry waved from beside a truck, blueprints tucked under his arm. "You ready?" he called. Evan nodded. "Yeah." The new cabin would be different. Wider windows, stronger beams. A place meant not just to survive, but to remain. That afternoon, a small ceremony took place in the square. No speeches, no banners, just people. Rowan stood beside a newly installed plaque near the old fir tree. It listed names, teachers, workers, residents, people who had been silenced, ignored, or pushed aside. The last line read simply, "Truth belongs to those who carry it." Valor lay at Evan's feet as the crowd dispersed, children laughing nearby. A little girl approached cautiously, holding a red ribbon. She tied it gently around Valor's collar, smiling shyly before running back to her mother. Evan knelt and removed the ribbon, tucking it into his pocket. "You earned that," he murmured. As evening settled, lanterns flickered on across Northwood Ridge. The town looked different now, not cleaner, not perfect, but honest in a way it hadn't been before. Evan stood on the edge of the square, Valor pressed against his leg, steady and warm. Some fires destroyed, others revealed what had always been there. And sometimes, Evan realized, justice arrived not with noise or triumph, but with the quiet certainty that the truth would no longer walk alone. As this story comes to a close, we are reminded of a quiet truth the world often forgets. Miracles do not always arrive as thunder in the sky or voices from the clouds. Sometimes they come softly, through the courage of an ordinary person who chooses not to look away, through a community that finally finds its voice, or through the instinct of a loyal dog who senses danger before words can be spoken. In the book of Psalms, it is written that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Perhaps that closeness doesn't always feel dramatic. Perhaps it feels like someone standing up when everyone else stays silent. Perhaps it feels like truth resurfacing after years of being buried. Or perhaps it feels like a gentle nudge in your heart, reminding you that what is right is worth protecting, even when it is hard. In our daily lives, we may never face burning houses or courtroom battles, but we all encounter moments when fear tempts us to stay quiet, when kindness costs something, when truth feels inconvenient. And in those moments, this story asks us a simple question. Will we walk past, or will we stand firm? If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of a time when someone stood up for you, or when you wished you had stood up for someone else, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your story may be the encouragement someone else needs today. If you believe stories can still bring light into a weary world, consider liking this video and subscribing to New Light Stories, so we can continue sharing moments of hope, courage, and faith together. And as you go about your day, may God watch over your home, steady your heart, and guide your steps. May He protect those you love, comfort those who are struggling, and remind you that you are never walking alone. Thank you for being here. May God bless you today and always.